Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we are speaking with Dr. Phil Giraldi about torture and the U.S. government's torture program. Dr. Giraldi is a former CIA counter-terrorism specialist and military intelligence officer. His columns frequently appear in the American Conservative Magazine, Huffington Post, Antiwar.com, and UNS.com. He is also the executive director of the Council for the National Interest. You can follow his work at theamericanconservative.com and uns.com. And you can find him on Facebook under Philip Giraldi. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/torture. Dr. Giraldi, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on.
Well, thank you very much. So let's get started by just making sure that everyone's on the same page as far as our listeners go by what we mean when we say torture, what that word means, and then the circumstances in which torture is generally used.
Well, the problem with torture is that there are a number of different definitions. And the United Nations, for example, has a very broad definition of torture, which essentially includes any kind of physical or severe psychological pressuring of an individual. And for the UN, that constitutes torture. For the United States government, it's gone through a number of changes. Under the Bush administration, it was considered to be not torture to do anything that did not destroy one of your organs. So that anything prior to that and before that would be considered acceptable, and that included waterboarding. The Obama administration has been a bit more ambiguous about the whole thing. They've banned what some of the torture techniques that the Bushes used, but they nevertheless still maintain that there are certain types of pressuring of individuals that can be considered legitimate.
What are some of the origins of the U.S. torture program? How did it come about, and what does it consist of today?
Well, today, of course, it's difficult to say because torture is done in secret, and our security agencies have basically become smart enough not to write this stuff down or to make videos of it. So, essentially, I would say that the organizations like the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the CIA and some of its overseas prisons are probably using stress-type situations where they'll take an individual and deprive them of sleep, for example, or make them stand in a stress position. Recently, we even learned of a new technique that was being used that was called the Palestinian chair. This was something that Israeli interrogators devised, where someone is strapped into a chair and it's sort of tipped forward into such a position that the person's muscles all start screaming after about 20 minutes. So there are a number of variations on torture, and one can assume that up to a certain point it is still the practice of the United States government.
So what agencies are involved in this practice as far as we know, and where is torture usually conducted?
Well, torture is usually conducted in places that are not necessarily susceptible to view from the public, either from the media or from organizations like the Red Cross. So there are overseas, there continue to be detention places in places like Afghanistan that are run by the military, that are run by the CIA, and these are the places where this sort of thing happens. And the people that are chosen as targets of this essentially are moved around. They're blindfolded, so they don't know where they're going. They don't know where they're coming, where they're arriving, and essentially are completely in the control of the people that are putting the pressure on them that we would consider torture.
Okay, and what process is used to identify whom to torture?
Well, this is a major issue. You know, the people that support torture, and there are a lot of them. I mean, there are professors of law like Alan Dershowitz at Harvard, who believe that torture is perfectly legitimate. And they always kind of link it to what they call a ticking bomb scenario, that you have somebody who walks into the room and he's a terrorist that you just captured down the street, and you suspect that he has placed a bomb in a bus station or a train station or in a school, and they consider it perfectly legitimate to torture this guy to get him to confess what he's done and where this bomb is. The problem with that argument is that there is not a single case that I know of in recorded history of torturing people where that's actually happened, where somebody has been subject to torture and as a result has revealed a terrorist incident that was about to take place. It's never occurred.
Can you go through some of the process legally? What has the kind of legal history been, and what cases have defined the legal history of torture in the United States?
Yeah, well, essentially, the White House and the administration relies on its own lawyers, relies on basically White House lawyers and Department of Justice lawyers, and there's been a lot of variation in terms of what these lawyers consider to be torture and what not. And the history of it was that under the Bush administration, there were lawyers that essentially drafted up memos that gave a green light to torture by the CIA in these overseas facilities. And essentially, as I mentioned earlier, they said that if you're not destroying someone's organ, if you're not destroying their lungs or their heart or, their liver or something like this, stressing them physically was okay. So that was maybe the low point of torture. Since then, the military has taken the lead in forbidding any of this kind of practice. They have what they call one of their guideline manuals, their training manuals, that instruct soldiers that torture of this kind, any kind of physical stressing of a prisoner, is not acceptable. But the rest of the U.S. government has not necessarily followed that. The CIA doesn't necessarily go by those rules, and nor does the FBI.
Yeah, I don't want to be too graphic, but give some of the tactics that are used for our listeners. I mean, this stuff is pretty brutal, and it's stuff I think people have to hear. So go into detail a bit more about the tactics and just the brutality of torture in general.
Sure. The method that is used most, that basically has been in the media, is the waterboarding. Now, waterboarding just sounds like you're dipping someone in water, but it's not. It's basically forcing someone into water to the point where the person is drowning. So you're dying, essentially, when you're undergoing waterboarding. And in the case of one prisoner, this process was repeated on him 127 times. So in other words, he was basically brought to the point of death by drowning, and then just pulled out before he would have actually died, and he was subjected to this 127 times. So that's certainly one method that has been highly publicized, and of course there are many other methods too. There was in Abu Ghraib, we've all seen the pictures of people being stripped naked, being put out in icy environments and doused with water, so they're freezing to death, deprived of food, hung up by their ankles, hung up by their wrists. The list goes on and on and on and on. Many of these methods are intended to induce a sense that you're dying. And in many cases, or in some cases certainly, people did die. And they were essentially, when that happened, they would strike them from the record as being prisoners, and they would just make them disappear. And this is part of the horror of the whole thing. You have someone who's picked up on the street for suspicion in Iraq, for example, in a suspicion of being involved in illegal activity. It might not even be anything like terrorism or homicide or anything like that. They wind up in this prison. Their family doesn't know they're there. They're tortured to confess to something, and they wind up dying. So it's the whole process is quite awful. In CIA prisons, they would insert brooms in people's rectums. They would do things that are just imaginable to us.
So are there any due process rights for torture victims, and is there any form of recourse for them?
Very little. This is part of the downside of the process. There have been a number of torture victims in Canada and Germany who have sued in U.S. courts for redress, and these people were completely innocent. They were, in one case, the Canadian was picked up because his name was close to the name of somebody they suspected, and he was completely innocent. And he was swept off to the Middle East, and he was tortured, and he sued in American courts. And the Obama administration intervenes in these processes and says that there are state secrets at stake here. Now, state secrets is a privilege that the executive branch has when someone in a court proceeding is about to reveal something that they consider to be highly classified. So the Obama administration has routinely used state secrets privilege to stop people who've been tortured from using our courts for redress.
And what other governments around the world have done the same thing, intervening in attempts at redress?
Well, none that I know of. There are a number of other countries where, of course, you have no access to the courts to bring this kind of case because in most countries you can't sue the government. But in the United States, one of the few places that you can, they've made it so you can't sue them anyway. So it's a kind of thing. If you're tortured by a government, you better forget about your rights. I don't know of too many cases, or indeed I can't think of any right offhand, where anybody has been compensated in a serious way for being tortured by a government.
And have any of these other governments assisted the United States in their torture programs?
Oh yeah, I mean the CIA was running secret prisons in a number of countries. They were running them in Poland, they were running them in Romania, they were running them in Thailand. They were assisting the torturers that were working for the governments in Morocco, in Egypt. They've had collaborative arrangements with the Israeli interrogators that were working with CIA and Army interrogators up in Iraq. So there have been a lot of instances of U.S. government working with people who are professional torturers from these various countries.
Do you have any idea of how many other governments have cooperated with the U.S. and as far as torturing people?
Well, as I said, the ones that were revealed were the ones I just kind of ran through. I would think there were certainly a number more. I would think the Jordanians cooperated with U.S. torture. And I know, for example, that the Syrians, back when the Syrians were still our friends, also accepted some prisoners who were tortured. So there are a whole lot of countries that have been implicit in this.
In Egypt as well, correct? During the
Egypt would certainly be one. Oh yeah, yes.
So can you talk about extraordinary rendition a little bit, what that is and sort of how that works?
Well, extraordinary rendition is just a way of torturing someone by proxy. You essentially send someone that is a suspect, whether for terrorism or something else, you send him to a friendly country. It might be their country of origin, but it might just be a friendly country, and the people in that country carry out the torture. So extraordinary rendition is a way of getting around existing U.S. restrictions on torture, because the United States, has signed international agreements saying that it would not torture people, and yet it's violated these agreements in practice. But for the United States, it's always more convenient to pretend that you're obeying the law and doing the right thing. So in a number of cases, they will do a rendition where they'll fly someone they'll put a bag over his head so he doesn't know where he's going. He doesn't know what's going on. He's in a prison, and all of a sudden he's blind and he's out. He's on an airplane. He winds up somewhere else, and where that somewhere else is where he's getting tortured.
It's absolutely horrible, and a lot of this stuff is I mean, it's very difficult for me to see how you can support it, but we're told all the time that this is a necessary evil. Can you explain some of the claims that are made by the supporters of torture, and are there any merits to their claims?
Well, again, the claim is that either you're going to get information that will save lives, or you will get information that will help you defeat a terrorist group. In reality, the U.S. Senate did an exhaustive study that took, I think, 9 months to do, and it turned out to be about 600 pages on the CIA torture program, and they concluded at the end of it that the CIA torture program for all the people who were tortured never actually produced any information that saved an American life or that produced information on a terrorist group that could not have been obtained otherwise. So the whole argument is a false argument. Essentially, the argument that terrorism can be defeated by torturing people, or that any crime can be deterred, whether we're talking about drugs or we're talking about anything else, that you can get the kind of information you need to defeat these criminals, this is a false argument.
Well, and doesn't it usually work the other way, where instead of defeating terrorism, it helps spread terrorism, and it creates blowback and serves as a recruiting tool?
Exactly. The blowback argument means that if I were an American soldier in Afghanistan and it were known that I was torturing people in the prison there in Bagram, that if the Taliban were to capture me, they would feel no problem with torturing me. So the blowback is very direct. It means that a country that uses torture will have other people use torture on its people, and that's not where we want to be at. And the other thing that you mentioned about recruiting, we know that terrorist groups or militant groups in general use the fact that they used Abu Ghraib, for example, extensively in their recruiting there. This is what the United States was doing to basically innocent people in many cases. This is exactly what they were doing. And the terrorist groups are not stupid, and they figured out that this is the way to get recruits, and they were correct.
Can you explain a bit more about what Abu Ghraib is for those who don't know?
Well, Abu Ghraib was an Iraqi prison. It was founded by Saddam Hussein, and it was taken over by the United States after the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. It then became a military prison. It was run by the military, but it also had CIA interrogators working there and working there on their own prisoners. And this was a place where torture was common. It was photographed, it was videoed, it was written up in reports, and in a number of cases, people were tortured, and as I mentioned before, actually died from the torture, and they were made to disappear from the records. So this was an egregious violation of international agreements about torture, and it was horrific in the way it was carried out. It was the pictures of male and female U.S. military officers stripping Iraqi prisoners naked and making them form pyramids naked, and bringing out dogs to attack them while they were doing this, and beating them with sticks and hanging them by their ankles and their wrists. I mean, this is just awful stuff beyond imagination.
All right, now I want to go back to the Senate torture report that you mentioned earlier. Can you talk a little bit more about that report, and also have there been any other torture reports or investigations carried out at a level comparable to that one?
Yeah, okay. Well, the Senate torture report was the most exhaustive by far. As I say, it took 9 months. It involved a number of staff members. It examined every single instance of CIA interrogation of prisoners that required or that used force or stress that might have been considered torture. And it went through every single one of these cases. I think there were 200 and something different cases that the Senate was able to identify. And it basically showed that in no cases was it clear that the torture had produced information that was not obtained elsewhere or could not have been obtained elsewhere. The CIA, in response to the Senate report, did its own report, which basically came to a different conclusion. It said that there were instances in which the torture produced information that led to other things that were not known by the U.S. government other than through the torture. But this has been disputed. Obviously, if you cherry pick information enough and you kind of, twist the result a bit, you can almost say anything when you're looking at this kind of thing. The CIA report is never, unlike the Senate report, which has mostly been made public, the CIA report, of course, was never made public. So whether they're being credible or whether they're just basically protecting themselves, which I suspect is the case, that is not completely 100% clear. The CIA, for example, destroyed all the videos that it made of the torture sessions it carried out in one of its major prisons, which was in Bangkok. So the CIA knows that essentially they were torturing people for no reason. And the reports that attempted to show it another way are really not credible.
Now, I know the U.S. government obviously would not release such a thing, but do we have any estimates on the statistics of number of people tortured per year? And kind of tied to that question, how many prosecutions and actual judgments for torture have we had over the years from various courts?
Yeah, well, that's two separate questions. The numbers of people being tortured is just not known, because it's not like there was a record being kept of them. The CIA did keep a record of some of the interrogations and made videos of them and transcripts and that sort of thing, but many of these were destroyed. I would say certainly that the numbers of people who were tortured as a result of the rendition program, and also in the CIA secret prisons, and also in the military prisons, certainly would number into the hundreds, maybe even into the low thousands. So that's the bottom line on the extent to which torture is used in the U.S. government. But as to who's been punished for this, no one. No one that I know of has been punished for torture. There was one CIA officer who apparently, according to some sources, was reprimanded, which means his career, maybe he didn't get promoted as quickly as he might have. But as far as I know, no one was ever fired.
Now, you said that it is illegal under international law, right? So has any cases been brought before the World Court or any other sort of international accountability?
Yeah, well, of course, that's an interesting aspect of it. Some cases have been filed in places like Britain and Canada, but they haven't gone anywhere. The International Criminal Court obviously would be a place to file charges that get all the way up the tree in terms of getting up to the top level of CIA with George Tenet, or the Pentagon with Rumsfeld. These charges have occasionally been filed, but they have not gone anywhere. They essentially the difficulty in dealing with the United States administration. When the ICC does a case, it's obligated to go to the country where these things happened, and it's obligated to take both sides of the argument. And that has proven impossible with the United States as a litigant in these cases, because the United States does not cooperate with them. The United States does not recognize the ICC.
So what role does the people at the very top of the U.S. government play in the torture program? And by that I mean George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Barack Obama, people of that sort. What role do they play?
Well, the fact is they were knowledgeable of it going on. So I would say that if you look at the international agreements of torture, which the U.S. has signed, these agreements say that either you carry out torture or you enable torture, you're just as guilty. And so I would say they're just as guilty. In fact, I would say they're more guilty. If you're someone in the CIA, you're like a middle-level officer or something like that, as I was in my career, and the director of CIA comes to you and says the president has a special assignment, we have to do this, and we have these prisoners, and boy, if we don't do something, there's going to be a nuclear bomb going off in Washington, and so on and so forth. That person is in an awful position. Even knowing that he shouldn't be doing this stuff, he's placed in a career-ending position. So I think the people at the top, the ones who order this kind of stuff, the ones who get the approval for this kind of stuff to be done from their lawyers, are the ones that are really guilty.
Well, and wouldn't it be great if they could be held accountable somehow?
Boy, would I love it.
Yeah. Is there any potential reforms or changes, or what does the future of this program look like? Is there any hope that we can look for? Is there a light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, there is light at the end of the tunnel at the moment, just because basically the reaction to the Senate report in particular has meant that the U.S. government really is very careful and cautious about doing anything that even equates to torture. But that doesn't mean it's gone away. I mean, we've had a number of presidential candidates, I don't have to name them, who basically said that they would use torture. They would do whatever it takes. They would kill people's families and do whatever it takes to defeat terrorism. Now, these people don't know what they're talking about, basically, because once you start killing people's families, as you pointed out earlier, all you're doing is creating a recruiting poster for more terrorists. So these people don't get it. Hopefully, if any of them are elected to high office, they will start to get it, but I'm not terribly optimistic. This could go the other way. This could go where these people in power believe they have a mandate to do whatever they want, and that's pretty scary.
No, it is. At least it seems like there's some sort of pushback against candidates for making statements like that, but I suppose if they actually get into office, then that would be a little bit different.
Yeah, and once they're in office, of course, they have to deal with Congress. So Congress is not necessarily a problem for them, but the courts, of course, could be a problem. This whole torture issue has never gone up to Supreme Court levels or anything like that. And they might actually develop a backbone and say that you shouldn't be torturing people. That would be nice to see.
All right, so before we wrap up, let me ask you about this term enhanced interrogation that is sometimes used instead. Where does that term come from, and why is it used?
Well, it's used so you don't have to say torture, but enhanced interrogation means essentially putting physical or severe psychological pressure on a prisoner to get him to talk. And they call it enhanced interrogation to make it sound better. Interrogation is a legitimate process that the police use to talk to a suspect and to find out what he was doing or what he might have done. So interrogation sounds okay. And enhanced interrogation doesn't sound too much worse, but of course the scary part is the enhanced bit. The enhanced bit means essentially physical, in most cases, physical pressure, which most people in the world will consider to be torture.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time. Do you have any recommended readings for our listeners on this subject? And where can our listeners go to follow your work?
Well, my work certainly. I mean, I write about torture fairly regularly, but I would think that if you go to websites like antiwar.com, they have a number of contributors, and they have fairly regularly articles about torture and about the downside of some American policies in overseas, and that's a good source to go to.
Okay, well, very good. Yeah, we'll definitely direct people there. It is a great resource. wakeupcallpodcast.com/torture is the show notes page for this episode, so we'll have a link to that. We'll link to your archive at the American Conservative Magazine and at uns.com. And to your Facebook page. So again, wakeupcallpodcast.com/torture is that website where everyone needs to go for the show notes page for this episode. And on that note, Dr. Giraldi, I want to thank you for joining us today and for helping us tackle this difficult and sometimes especially graphically difficult issue, but an issue that isn't very important to know about. And we'd love to speak with you again sometime soon.
I'd like that. Thanks very much.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.